We're back.
Good morning.
Hello, we're back on Morrison Avenue. This is chapter 3 for the Robert Booth story. For those of you who are regular viewers to Hometown Cable, we've been here before. I knew the way down the street. I knew how to get up the driveway. And we have been talking with Robert, one of the great patriots of this area. He's given speeches to those people in the North Country who are familiar with Plattsburgh and Clinton County. They know that Bob has been, and his family before him, prominent citizens of Plattsburgh and Clinton County, but our focus has been on his World War II experience as a prisoner of war. Stories that it's hard for us now, 60 years later, to accommodate in our lives of relative peace and quiet. It's an experience that I don't know how many prisoners of war were there. Do you have any clue, Rob?
American?
Yeah.
Yes.
How many? You actually have it written. I should have known. I should have known.
156,000 known American prisoners of war. That was two sides, but there weren't very many in Japan, mostly the Philippines.
Some of the experiences and some of those people who were prisoners of war have never had a chance to tell their stories. And we think it's important to chronicle your experience. You've told it in public, and of course your family is relatively familiar with it, but we have decided to take this opportunity to get it on tape forever and ever and ever, and I'm delighted. It's hard for me to remember what you and I have talked about each session, so I go home when we put it on television and watch that on television and say, yes, that's a heck of a story. And we knew we wouldn't be able to do it in one shot. So we came back a second time, and then we came back a third time. And now, as we're recording this on the last day of August 2005.
In the middle of a hurricane.
In the middle of the remnants of Katrina, I mean, who came up the, apologies to anybody named Christina, as it came up the coast and dumped a whole bunch of rain on us. And you just got back from sounds like a wonderful trip up north to Alaska.
Absolutely. As you said, this is 60 years ago. This is the year of the 60s in my life because that was an anniversary trip for my wife and myself. We were a little bit late for the event, but that was a treat we gave ourselves. Also, my 60-year college reunion, which I never graduated from.
Yeah, we talked about
that. 60 years of freedom from the events we've been talking about. That was a big event, you can be sure.
You know, when you're 20, the age 60 seems like a long ways away, and some of us when we were 20 thought we'd be lucky if we made it to 60.
Amen.
And now here you are.
Looking back 60, and it's still amazing.
And it's still amazing. But thank the good Lord for robust good health and your ability to remember all these things and your experience, and I'm sure that our lives will be better because we've learned about this piece in history. I think it's important to go back and remember history because this was a huge, important part in our nation's history, wasn't it? The 1940s.
Oh my, yes. Memory is taken a little bit broadly here. I've been keeping track of things and finding people and reading and clipping and so on. So the many blank spots in my memory and some of the, let's say, embellishments that I've added here.
I do that
from time to time. I've just been saving up things for a long time, trying gradually to make sense from what others knew and what others did. And of course, the whole thing makes a horrifying and fascinating picture when you consider all that went on and how it affected
Well, it's a tribute to the human spirit. It's a tribute to what our country was all about, the reasons that war was fought in the first place. And secondly, because your experience is different from anybody else who was a prisoner of war, and it's like you and I watching the same movie, we'd have a different reaction to it. And even though people might have been with you, when you were a prisoner of war, their stories would be different.
Certainly.
Because everything that happens affects us all differently.
That's right. That's right. I think mine is a fairly average story, better than some, worse than others. but very, very average considering 100.
Well, you've told it many times, and I've heard you tell it in public, and it's a very moving story and a very important story to preserve. And Calvin and I are in the business of preserving history.
So it's doing it very well.
Well, we're just blown away by the fact that you've allowed us to come into your home for the third time now, and I don't know if we can finish it up today, but
we'll have a look because I keep thinking of things.
He's got
digging.
He's got a plan. He's already told us what we're going to talk about for the first half hour anyway. So let us continue with the Robert Booth story from Morrison Avenue in Plattsburgh. Bob, a few months ago, my wife, who loves to just get things out of drawers and put it down in front of me to see what kind of memories it will elicit, handed me a little tiny envelope, and it said V-mail on it. And it dawned on me, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Now we have a thing called email, but in the 1940s, during the war period, we had a thing called V-mail. So I did the research and read a lot of letters and read her letters from her brother, who was killed in the Second World War, and wrote about it. And people commented because many of the younger people had, of course, never heard of email.
Right.
You got some out today and said, here's the way we communicated. So let's talk a little bit about that. What have you got here?
Well, you heard about the 60th anniversary.
Yes.
It was brewing before that. So I went overseas, and the correspondence with my wife,
Helen.
and hers to me, Helen, yeah, was handled while I was overseas by V-mail. Well, V-mail was written on a thing like this, which is a single sheet. It's one letter I wrote to her. Got V-mail prominently on the front and on the back, and it neatly folds into an envelope with a sticker on the top.
Oh, yeah.
And it goes like that into the Postal Service. Received at the other end, it has been photographed, and this is about 4 inches by 3 inches, and a letter I wrote, you just saw, is now this size when you get it, having been processed through photography because there's no way that the U.S. forces could supply guns and bullets and handle all the mail for 8 or 9 million people. So that, and these, I think, were carried across the ocean by air. I'm not quite sure how they got to us. That's an exchange of email. My wife was not sometimes using email, and I wasn't.
V-mail, yeah,
I'm sorry,
V-mail.
V-mail,
Yeah.
V-mail, V for victory. But this is what I sent. She received it, but it did not leave my area without being censored, and that's what the sticker here. It starts on one side, opened by USA Army Examiner. Well, now that wasn't me in my case, but one of the jobs I had, along with a lot of others, was reviewing letters and cutting out sections that weren't fit or giving them back to be reworked.
They sometimes look like a roadmap by the time they got there.
That was done at the company level, so to
Yeah.
speak, before it left. And of course, there was a pileup or missing mail, depending on what the company was involved in at the time. But that's how it was handled.
Just to finish that little thing about the V-mail itself.
Yes.
And you alluded to it. The reason was they miniaturized it by putting it on microfilm, and there were V-mail processing centers. And
Yes.
They were big processing centers. If you can figure all the mail that came into there, and somebody had to take photographs of that, miniaturize it,
Right.
and you could put thousands and thousands of pieces of mail in a mail bag that would have taken 50 mail bags before that.
Right,
And it was an amazing thing. They only did it for a few years,
right.
but it allowed them to process and get this mail over a lot quicker. And most of it did come by plane. And even though we do email now instantaneously, that was far quicker. The process, even with having to take a picture of it, put it on the microfilm and get it over, was far quicker than the normal process, which was when you sent a regular letter, you were lucky if it got home before you moved to
Yes,
another
that's
location.
Right. Oh yeah. My mail kept coming in for probably a couple of months after I was missing.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, there, it gives you an idea.
Yeah.
We're used to an age of instant communication around the world.
Yeah.
And even,
And now the soldiers in Iraq can step back on their day off, so to speak, communicate by email for a short period of time directly home.
or get on a radio cell phone.
Sure, yeah,
And call
or a
home
new cell
just
phone,
standing
which they-
there right in the middle of the
They can
desert.
sit in a foxhole with their cell phone, and I'm sure they do.
Isn't it
Yeah,
amazing?
yeah.
So things were far. 60 years did make a huge difference in communication.
Made a very big difference. Well, that's so much for V-mail.
Calvin's our gallery here. We don't have much of an audience, but Calvin's behind the camera,
Well,
as
he's a
he
good one.
always is, and he's a good one because he comes up with questions that I don't think of. When we were talking about V-mail, you had an original letter, and you had the V-mail copy, and I would imagine that there aren't too many left in the United States where the original would have been somehow returned to you, and you're not exactly sure how it happened, but you can speculate. You wrote this on 28 December 44.
Yes.
Where were you at that time, do you think?
In Belgium, we had just completed a 250-mile move across country from Alsace-Lorraine in middle of France. And this was written when we, I think, had just set up our gun batteries and were beginning to fire on the enemy. And I hadn't gone anywhere yet. I was still with the batteries. I can speculate that since I wasn't captured for about 10 days after that, that this was done and perhaps never left the area because we were in such a state of turmoil, and may simply have been short-stopped and never gone away until it arrived with what they eventually sent home to me. In other words, it never left town. On the other hand, it may have got held up in some other way because the whole military system was caught up in an intense battle at that time involving 500,000 men before it grew bigger.
You were probably had already started firing by that time.
We were surely started firing.
Yeah.
And I can see that the turmoil of trying to stop the offensive and hold it in its tracks, which wasn't settled by that time.
Yeah.
But it was soon after it stopped, but not for another 10 days.
But normally in the process, once this letter went to that area where
Right.
the V-mail was actually photographed and sent along, then this would probably be destroyed. I don't imagine the original letters were
I don't see
were
how
preserved.
I don't see how they could preserve them. No.
Yeah. So
No.
that's
So
kind
this
of an
is a-
anomaly, and it's
it's
kind
a-
of a neat one, isn't
Well,
it?
it's a lucky anomaly, yeah. And it could have just stopped because they were so busy they couldn't handle the mail, which was normal and natural. I mean, it went in fits and starts. If you had
Yeah.
a quiet period, you could do things like mail. But if you were fighting and running around and struggling for your life in the weather and all that, you didn't have time for mail or sentimentality.
And well, I should point out that there are only certain areas where V-mail was working. I mean, they had these
I'm sure
huge
of that.
processing centers,
Yeah.
but
Nothing-
everybody who fought wasn't able to
No.
take advantage of V-mail.
Where we were, nothing was working at that time.
Yeah.
It was total chaos. So it may well have just stopped and eventually come back to me when they cleaned out my locker, so to speak, and sent me some remnants. And I just didn't keep track of that. I had no idea.
But how? Yeah.
It's unique to have it.
All right, but it's something to think about. Now,
Right.
this next thing is you mentioned before that part of your job at one point in time was to censor
Absolutely.
the letters, and Calvin's question was what kinds of, we still talk about censorship
Yes.
in different forms, what kinds of things did you snip out, and how did that work?
Well, certainly the first thing you took out was any indication of where you were. Not much detail as to what you were doing. Items that you might, as a matter of judgment, feel if they were intercepted would give help to the enemy.
Sure.
And I'm sure we had a cookie cutter list of things that we had to cut out.
Oh,
We were instructed but then it's an individual thing when you're sitting there with your razor blade cutting out the heart of
So
somebody's
you
letter.
actually cut out
Oh, yeah.
words,
Yes.
phrases, sentences?
It wasn't lined out, yes. Mm-hmm.
And you couldn't cross it out because somebody
No.
might be able to see through it, so
Sure.
you actually snipped it.
That's right. That's right.
And then you had to destroy those pieces of...
Some people got letters that looked like a Swiss cheese. It was
I can imagine what they looked like, yeah.
more viewing through
So
than
how
it
long
was.
did you do that?
Oh, it was sporadic.
You did it from
Yeah,
time to
it just,
time?
it just, if I had slack time here, it was handed to me and
A whole
I
bunch
started
of mail.
censoring but we had 4 officers in our battery and it would get handed to one or another who wasn't working very hard at the moment.
But
just
it was,
to keep it moving.
It was kind of an interesting
Well,
responsibility,
Well,
wasn't it?
it was, and it was very important because it was a morale item.
Yeah.
You couldn't just sit on it and stash it or burn it in the company stove or anything like that.
Well, we have, just to add a little perspective to it, we're talking about 60 years ago, and now we have leading, and I use that word carefully, in quotes, reporters who are going on television and ultimately being chastised for saying, here we are, and
Yes.
saying on instant national, international television where they're located.
Mm-hmm.
And people are saying, wait a minute, you can't tell people where you are. And because the communications where they are, especially when this war in Iraq began, we had what they call a whole new thing called embedded reporters.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, during your time period, there were reporters that went to certain scenes, and some of them became very famous war
Sure.
reporters.
They were as embedded as anybody, but
They were-
didn't have the name.
You didn't have, it was completely different.
Yeah.
But because communications are instantaneous now, those embedded reporters during the Iraq War had to be very careful
Yes.
about saying where they were going and what they were doing.
Yep.
So it's a whole different
That would be
ballgame.
always so, but with so much electronic communication that goes on, both sides have it to an extent. They're listening. It's very hard to keep a secret.
Well,
You can tap anybody's electronic communication, and that's a instant part of the game, of course.
and they're doing it now in ways that you and I can only, it's hard for us to conceive
Never
of.
heard
But,
of and can't comprehend if we do.
but in this time period that we're talking about,
Yeah.
60 years ago,
It was-
we were breaking codes.
Yes.
We were doing whatever we could to intercept
Yeah.
radio transmissions, letters, newspapers, and
Right.
all sides involved in the Second World War were engaging in this kind of
Doing the same thing. Unfortunately, we were very successful breaking codes. They did it. We had it, and had the information that we had broke a code, and we were able to keep it secret. So for years, key code of I think the German Navy, which would relate to all other things as well, was broken and known to our people, and the same thing with the Japanese purple code that they thought was so great, and that was a naval thing as well. But we had the key to it, so we knew a great deal that they didn't know we knew. On the other hand, they knew a lot about us too, that they were pretty good at. So it never ends.
Yeah, they couldn't speak what?
Navajo.
Oh, they couldn't speak
No,
Navajo.
that was the one secret that worked.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And there's still a few of those wonderful people still alive,
Oh,
and every
yes.
now they're interviewed, and they're just as amazed today as they were back then that process was used.
Yeah.
What else? Have you got other stories here?
I've got another story here. As I said before, I was at the Limburg prison camp with a man from Plattsburgh by the name of Tom Barry.
I remember, yeah.
Tom was a sergeant in the Canadian Army. He went across the border and enlisted, and he ended up being captured at some time not long before I was in Belgium, I guess. We were at the same camp. Tom was left behind because he was sick when I was liberated in the latter part of March from, I wasn't liberated, I was moved. Tom was kept, and then he was overrun by United States troops, but because he was a Canadian, he was merely moved on to Canadian Army authority, which meant that he had perhaps a week or 10 days before he was telling anything to his people. So the first word that my folks got was a telegram from Tom to his mother that said he had seen me in late March, and that's all. That's the first they knew that I really had lived that long. When he came to light, he was interviewed apparently in Germany by reporters from the Montreal La Presse or something. Anyway, I have a clipping my father made of a Montreal newspaper which told of his return. And he and another fellow who I also knew who was with him were interviewed and gave descriptions of how they retreated. It won't show on your camera at all, the print is too fine, but I have copied off what Tom Barry said about his interrogation. He was captured in January carrying military photos. For his interrogation, he was forced to stand at attention for 12 hours in a small room while an interrogator attempted to obtain information. Previously, he had been kept standing for hours in a room with hot and cold air alternated and from which he caught a severe cold that affected his hearing. This ailment is now under treatment. He's been liberated. In Aldershot, England, the Canadians told of forced marches, 300 Allied soldiers killed by strafing or they fell by the wayside on road marches, were killed in action or missing in action.
It's interesting that you bring up this topic of interrogation because it's with Guantanamo and all the other factors involved in these recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're talking about the Geneva Convention and interrogation again, and yes, it was a huge factor back then.
Right. Well, the Geneva Convention was in effect at that time. That was 60 years ago. That was a limit to which interrogation of Tom Barry went, and he was a hot item due to the fact that he had some kind of photos on his body that touched it off so that he seemed like an important person, and they went after him to an extent. There was no hue and cry about the way he was treated. He did not specifically tell me the details of what he had gone through when the period of time that I knew him. So that was news, but it popped out when I was looking at it as something that was very relevant to modern times. That was not regarded as being an illegal action that had happened to him at that time, not under terms and conditions of those days.
You know, it's interesting how different things are scrutinized today than they were back then.
Right.
Some reporters are doing things just because they need a story.
Right.
And other people are honestly scrutinizing the processes. And this is a discussion that perhaps needed to be held. But you and I have a different attitude as we're older, and you went through this time period.
Well, yeah. My interrogation was different because they automatically knew I didn't know anything. So they were filling in their notebook and gaining their time and checking off their 15 interrogations for the day and using me. That's exactly all the good I was to them, no matter what they did.
That's interesting. You said that before, and I found it humorous at the time, but how would they possibly know that you didn't know anything? Just because
I'd been a captive for 4 to 6 weeks.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
What would I know about current events?
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So you were interrogated somewhat as soon as they caught you.
Mm-hmm. Well, the worst that I had, besides being an eyeball-to-eyeball interrogation discussion, which was really quite moderate, I was in solitary confinement for 3 days before that, with no comment or no contact from anybody, period, except a Lithuanian slave who brought me meals.
So you really didn't know what was going to happen at that point in time.
No, I mean,
as you said before.
Sweating it out is important, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
The anticipation. But it didn't amount to anything, and there was nothing to get. It was not difficult for me. I didn't have to pretend anything.
Yeah. So your experience was different from his.
Much.
Did you, now he was released before you were,
Yes.
and so your parents got information that he had had some contact with you, and that's very interesting. Did you maintain a friendship with him after?
Oh, yes, he came back here. He lived in Lion Mountain. He worked in the mines, and I knew him, well, I guess he was a charismatic fellow, and after the mines closed, he, quote, retired. His family broke up. He remained, but he was Irish to the soles of his feet. And he elected in his declining years to go back to Ireland and to live in Ireland until he died.
No kidding.
And he did that. He picked out a town. I don't know how he selected it, and he was a great reader, very, very intelligent, conversational kind of guy. Conversational was a limited adjective. It never stopped. But he would take his book and he would set himself up in his favorite pub and he would read the day out. And that's what he did here in his retirement as well. He eventually died under the care of the Little Sisters of the Poor in whatever this town was, which was a Catholic religious order that took care of the sick and the disabled and whatever.
That was a good experience that you had in knowing the man all those
Yes.
years and having gone through
Yeah.
this and learning what his points of view were. That's great.
Yeah.
What else have you got here?
Well, quick picture of liberation, freedom, when General Patton struck the Hammelburg prison camp. And this is a picture of a gate of the Hammelburg camp, and it shows the kind of buildings there were there. It was a military training camp for the German army at one time, and therefore those are permanent buildings. They had no heat, but that's what it looked like. That is the second liberation. It came 10 days after I was, but it shows the reception. It shows the tanks at the gate. They probably didn't have to knock down the fence at that time, but they drove through it, and it's obviously been repaired. Hello. Well, anyway.
Yeah, we paused for a moment because Helen came in to say hello. The rain continues. It's a dark and dismal day in the North Country, and there were some dark and dismal days during the 1940s in this whole process. And for those of you who just turned on the television, we're interviewing for the third time Robert Booth here on Morrison Avenue in Plattsburgh about his war experiences. So, what do we got here?
Well, it's a second picture of the Hammelburg Gate, taken apparently as a result of the same final liberation of the camp that I just showed on the previous picture. It's not my freedom. I was 10 days before that, and I was down the road and past Nuremberg by that time. However, I'll throw in a sidelight here. We were talking about our going out on the country and trying to make it back to the lines. I had 3 people I've spoken of before, I think. There was a Lieutenant Inge who was captured with me, who had, while he had been in this camp, gotten into the trading business with the Serbian contingent. We had the Serbian general staff, which had got captured in one bunch when Yugoslavia, Serbia were captured by the Germans early in 1942, Easter week. And these men were all there, and they had a pretty well organized institution, and they did a lot of trading, and they did trading outside the fence. So Lieutenant Inge got in on that. When he had to come back after this first liberation did not work, he joined the Serbian army. He went through the hole in the fence. They gave him a Serbian uniform, and when they did the roster reading a couple of times a day, he'd stand up and he'd talk, double talk. And the Germans didn't know double talk from the Serbian language. So he
that
survived
interesting?
for 10 days in that mode.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. There was another Lieutenant Fiskey who was captured and joined together very early in the game. I never had known him before, but we rode away from the front on top of a lot of oil cans in the back of a truck. He came back with a buddy of his, and they had somehow made friends with hospital staff. There was a hospital in the camp which had nothing to work with except a building and a couple of rusty instruments, but it was run by soldiers of the British or Australian Army forces. And they went into the hospital, and the hospital attendants wrapped them up in bandages and put them in bed as casualties of this raid, which had got into fighting outside. And they stayed as in the camp, in bed, as hospital patients until they were freed. The other fellow that I have been captured with elected to depart camp with the commander of Americans, Colonel Good, and go on the road and into the trains, and he ended up in the same direction I did, in the same camp. I don't know whether he walked out or whether he trained out, but he elected to stay with the group. So that was just a sidelight of how some, I of course hit the hills, came back within 2 days and was recaptured. That's what happened after the Hammelburg liberation. I wanted to comment also that there was a time when massive firestorm raids were conducted day and night by the British at night and the Americans in the daytime on the cities of Dresden and Leipzig in Germany in the middle of February 1945. And they were devastating. They caused reactions by the guards that looked over us, whose families were wiped out, and that's what happened to Lieutenant Weeks. He was killed not responding fast enough to an air raid by a soldier whose family had been killed in one of those raids. Hitler went right into orbit as a result of that and made a decree that all Air Force camps would be exterminated. Now, aviators were set apart from others in long-standing camps. So he decreed, and he actually dispatched a regiment of SS troopers directed toward one particular camp, which was up near the Baltic Sea, I think, simply to clean it out, lay waste, and kill everybody that was in it. Then, apparently, he extended his edict to say that never mind keeping them for bargaining purposes, exterminate all prisoners of war. So that list continued for a period of time. We were unaware of these things.
Thank goodness.
Later history said that the commanding general of all prisoner of war activities, Colonel General Berger, refused. He couldn't refuse. He found other ways not to do it. And he did not carry out orders to get into an extermination. In fact, when this unit was dispatched toward the Air Force camp, he sent a group of Air Force soldiers, I don't know where he gathered them from, to intercept that group and do battle with it. Meanwhile, politics had been working, and he and his people who were avoiding dealing with this started working the political game. And if you remember, Eva Braun was Hitler's long-standing mistress, and eventually they were married in the bunker before they committed suicide. Colonel Berger somehow got to her to work on Hitler to change his mind, and also got to Hermann Goering, who was essentially the second in command of all Nazi activities, and he was sympathetic. He was an aviator, of course, in the First World War, so he was sympathetic to aviators, and this attracted his attention right away, that orders were sent out to exterminate our camp of aviators, so that one thing in another caused that madness to be dispelled. They changed the subject with him, and the order just never went anywhere, but it was out. And
So you think there was a real moral dilemma with these people who
Sure.
understood that
Yes.
that Hitler was indeed a madman toward the end? Many people did.
Sure, sure. Well, that's in February '45. Things are going bad. He's losing. He's disoriented. An attempt had been made to assassinate him, and that had disabled him a considerable amount. And these other people, of course, were planning to survive. They didn't want to have blood on their hands when it came time to deal with all the things that they knew they would be confronted with, like the war crimes trials that were warming up. I mean, it was known that those would be held. And these people were covering their own positions. So it had become impossible for Hitler to give maniacal orders that would be carried out. And Colonel General Berger was just one of many that were not interested in being charged with a massacre of prisoners.
That's a very interesting fact that I was unaware of. I didn't know he had given orders to exterminate
Yeah, that's
prisoners.
this is something that I don't know and I don't remember, but I have found out
Yeah.
over the past 60 years. It's documented and well studied, and so that's how it goes as well when you're dealing with a madman.
Next chapter.
You want to get back
Sure.
to where we were.
Yeah.
Well, as I recall, we had three of us had made up our mind to try and find the American lines, and we had gone out and found that navigation was very difficult in the daylight, especially. We had gone a certain distance before we simply ran out of gas, but we also ran into a back road and a supply line of German horses and wagons, which were commonly in use by the German armies of all kinds throughout the war. A great deal of food and ammunition and clothing and everything else that an army needed were carried by horses and wagons. And we ran into that and decided that we better not reveal ourselves, so we just collapsed a few hundred yards away from the road and essentially slept the day out. We of course were debilitated physically. We'd lost a great deal of weight. We were suffering malnutrition and lack of any physical activity. So if you remember, I could not go far wearing my military winter coat, which was a 3-layered field coat kind of a thing. I just couldn't lug that thing along, and I ditched it, so that I didn't have that, and we couldn't handle the box of food rations that we had started off with. We had to break that down, so that we were just absolutely exhausted. Toward evening, when things seemed to be quieted, we picked up again and started on our route.
How many? Just two of you?
Besides myself, three of us.
Three of all together. Okay,
Yeah.
I got you.
Lieutenant Cocconi from the West Coast, Lieutenant Schneider from the Midlands, and me
And you. Okay.
from Plattsburgh, New York. And they were infantry soldiers, so they knew about getting around all right, but we had nothing to work with. And at night, you don't quite remember where the moon comes up, but then again, if you remember, it comes up at over about 90 degrees of the horizon, even here. So what do you steer by? And when there's no North Star that you can see, that doesn't help. So as I said, at night, we were steering by the ring of fire of artillery bursts at the front, which we could see the flashes in the sky. But and while it was helpful to say where we should be headed, it didn't give us a focus because it was almost the whole horizon that you could see. We came to a river, and that's difficult because the river was as big as one of the streams that feeds the Saranac River here, and it was of unknown depth, and how are we going to get across that? Well, we decided we should go down along the river downstream to see what was there, and we soon ran into a farm dog in a farmyard who started baying his head off, and we didn't get too close to that. We turned around and went the other way and found a boat. So we had ourselves a river crossing. And these two other fellas had never been near water, never had been near boats. I had, so I was the captain and the crew.
Oh boy, here we go.
Big issue was to try and keep them from falling out or slamming things around. They were thrashing with the oars, and there was, I remember, an anchor chain that rang like a bell. And it seemed to me that we would have an army waiting on the other side, but we made it. We turned the boat loose, or I don't know what, and went off into the woods. Again, we were staying off roads as if we could, without much direction. And after a period of time, we heard sounds ahead of us that we couldn't quite make out. They could have been people, or they could have been something else. And of course, we froze in our tracks and listened and waited and tried to interpret what that was. We decided that it was deer out there grazing in a field and snorting at each other and making stomping noises and things like that. So we finally took a deep breath and screwed up our courage and decided that was the choice and passed through to the next stop.
Boy, if this isn't the theme for a good movie, I don't know what is. This is very...
The Great Escape. It's been done.
I'm with you every step. So what happened then?
Well, we passed through the fields and got into some more woods and another hillside that went down in front of us, but at that hillside, it was after dark by that time, we could smell tobacco smoke, and then we began to hear voices. And then
You're telling me it wasn't deer stomping around?
It wasn't deer stomping around.
Oh,
it was German soldiers.
Oh, there is a difference,
who were well behind the lines, so they were relaxed and at ease, and they had been wandering around visiting different outposts or I don't know what. And they were chatting, and they were saying good Nacht and going back to where they belonged, and they were smoking. And German tobacco was very harsh tobacco, so it was very distinctive. It wasn't Yankee tobacco. And many of them had, if not hobnails on their boots, they had metal horseshoe type wear strips on the heels.
Yeah.
So on these gravel roads, they crunched and they clinked
Yeah.
and all that. And the smart thing to do is to wait until the people pass, which we did. Then we went down.
Sounds very reasonable to me.
Then we went down the hill and up the other side where there was another hill, and all of a sudden there was somebody hollering halt in German.
Oh boy.
And then there was machine gun fire, which was bothersome, as you can see.
Yes, I would imagine it was bothersome.
We could not make out immediately where the machine gun was, number one. It wasn't directly firing at us, it was a warning. But on the other hand, they didn't know who we were or where we were, and I still had that hand grenade, but I couldn't do anything with that. It was much too far away. So we had ourselves a little conference about what was the smart thing to do and what wasn't. And Lieutenant Schneider, who was a second-generation German, entered further negotiations and worked us out of it peacefully without getting shot. So we were in camp again, and turned out that it was a military unit that had set up nighttime bivouac in that neighborhood, and we just ran into them by dumb luck. I think that probably they were, in essence, closing the loop on the liberation of this camp, and that was part of the dragnet that was out looking for escaped prisoners. Because it turned out we were not very far. We'd apparently gone in a great circle, and we were not very far from the Hammelburg prison camp when they delivered us back the following morning. They stuck us in a barn and then hiked us down the road for some distance, but not far, and we were right back there again where we started within about 36 hours. It was freedom for a brief time.
Oh, just
So,
a brief interlude, huh?
Yeah. We were back at the camp. By the time we got there, some 900 of what were found to be, I'll get to this in a minute, about 1,100 Americans. 900 had already departed. There had been several different columns on foot, plus one trainload. There was a second trainload that we were put on, and a third trainload that followed us, and that moved those foot marches and the trainloads moved us out and headed us toward Nuremberg. Now, we didn't know that, but that was 2 overnights to go 100 miles to get to Nuremberg. And that was successfully done, in spite of what I've said about the dangers of railroad travel. We were threatened. We stopped. The engine hid, but we never got caught up with. Train number 3 was almost strafed. It was very, very close. But that total move to Nuremberg worked out all right. We were outfitted again from storehouses at the Hammelburg camp before we hit the highway. And the supplies were limited American. I already had the boots of Lieutenant Weeks, which had been saved, and that was part of the American quartermaster supply. But the Serbian army left a lot of stuff, so that I was issued a new overcoat, Serbian army style, which was warm and snug, well worn, and very tight at the shoulders. So I walked kind of like this with my shoulders,
Yeah.
but it buttoned up and it kept you warm because it wasn't springtime yet. And later on, it was very helpful when it rained. And because I didn't have a hat anymore, I lost that. Goodness knows I had a hood on my winter coat, but I don't know. They confiscated my helmet and my hat, and I didn't have one. That was distinctly unmilitary, just like my bath clogs had been. So that from the Serbian supplies, I was issued a Serbian fatigue hat. You know, the cloth one that American soldiers wore, only it was Serbian style. I have it here, and my attire consisted of all the winter clothes I had on as my basic uniform, the new overcoat, Lieutenant Weeks' boots, and this hat.
A potpourri.
Yeah, a potpourri, and it certainly cut a military figure, but there are many, many people that looked exactly the same way, and we, I don't remember the details, but we were loaded on the train as usual, and we ended up in Nuremberg next. I have the hat, and I have the jacket that I wore during all this time here that really should have a look, I think, at some time. We do it now. We can.
I'd like to stop and see it right now while we're talking about it.
Okay.
Wait a second, we'll start it.
And,
We'll start it. We're
well,
going
let's
again.
Let's get this organized, just a minute.
Aha.
That's the hat, and I made that out of the bottom of a tin can, so.
Oh, you
know, I
gotta
was
be,
U.S.
you
Army
gotta be kidding.
This is the field coat field jacket that I was issued. It's gone through several high school kids as well. It wasn't as bad. But I wore that from at least October of 1944 until I was liberated. It was such a treasure that I kept it. This here is white paint that came from the bulkhead of the SS Louis Pasteur, which was the troop ship we went overseas on. They just
gotta
rehabbed
be
it, and some things were still sticky, and that's where I leaned up against the sticky. So it's a very historical event.
I love it.
That's the patch of the 87th Division.
Uh-huh.
So,
Okay, ready?
well, you want me to? I'll put it on. How'd that?
Yeah. Go ahead, let her go. We want to see the jacket right on you. The camera's running.
It's several layers itself. Had a liner to go with it, so I had.
Still fits. Look at this. That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
This
And
is
talk
it.
about this hat now. This
I will. This Part of our being re-equipped, as I said, included a Serbian military cap, which is this. It's a pretty green, dark green color, and the gold bar on it I manufactured out of the bottom of a can of some kind that came in the Red Cross package.
A tin can.
So
I love it. So we know you were a lieutenant
I
anyway.
gained some rank that I didn't have before.
Yeah.
So I
Why not?
went off on the march with this that I had had at least since October of 1944, and it's been worn since by several high school children of my family, but so it's more worn than it was. The golden acorn is the patch of the 87th Infantry Division, and we have on the coat tail where the white tag is, white paint, which came from the interior of the steamship we went across the ocean in, the Louis Pasteur. We left New York City and traveled across, and I got that paint on there while on the troop ship. So this is a very famous outfit, along with the Serbian greatcoat and Lieutenant Weeks's boots. And if you don't think I was not alone, if you can imagine a ragtag-looking army from there on, because everybody was looking more or less the same. We were unloaded in Nuremberg from the trains and marched a mile or two or three, I have no idea, through the city of Nuremberg, which was a prime target, and it had been bombed repeatedly. The streets were full of rubble, but there were paths that had been cleared. The buildings, in many cases, were standing, but if you look closely, you realized that they were masonry buildings and they were completely burned out shells. There was nothing there. I have absolutely no recollection of ever seeing a human being in Nuremberg where we passed through.
Isn't that amazing?
And
everybody evacuated?
dead. Fire bombs, tens of thousands.
Oh my goodness.
And that's the story of German cities,
Yeah.
partly. If they were hit by bombs, there'd have been much more rubble. But these were fire losses. We ended up in a tent city in an athletic stadium somewhere in the middle of Nuremberg. It wasn't the Olympic Stadium, but it was a similar thing. And we were there for April 1st, which was Easter. So we celebrated Easter under tents, wondering what would happen next. Spent a couple of days there, and then were gathered together once more and put on the road with 1,000 of us at least. Records say 1,650 departed Nuremberg. They left Nuremberg on foot, probably 6 different columns of troops that were traveling on parallel roads, headed, we didn't know, the top brass apparently did know, but we were headed south in Germany toward Munich and toward a prison camp called Moosburg. Just a few days on the 25th of March, before the liberation of the Hammelburg camp, the Red Cross, International Red Cross, had received from U.S. military a complete roster of the American officers, of which there were 1,092 in that camp, plus 11 French, all printed and delivered to the Red Cross ahead of this incident, and it got to Switzerland, I guess, was preserved, and this is one of the things that you turn up 56 years later. I was fishing for somebody that I was trying to find. I got a response through American POW magazine, who answered a question about the man I was looking for, and said, "Oh, by the way, I've got a roster of everybody that was in that camp.
Isn't that
I'll send you a
amazing?
copy." Yes.
Wow.
Yep, and I have it. There it is. I counted it, and there's 1,092 plus the Frenchmen who were there for sure. Some of those people, well, many of those people were marched out. The 3rd of April was when we all left town with 6 columns on the road. Talk about the food supply at that point. We were pretty well exactly in the middle of Germany when we were in Nuremberg. The German food supply petered out with us, but we were getting closer to Switzerland, where American International Red Cross food packages came from. So we were starting to receive supply from that source, and actually we were beginning to live better in that sense, which was very, very important to us. I'll speculate a little about starvation. We simply were starving when, in the months before that, everybody was. We lost X amount of pounds. Nobody was weighing us, but I'd estimate 25 to 30. You could count ribs of every single person, and many people were in grave condition. By the time they were liberated, some hadn't made it or died on a stretcher being carried out. So I had a close friend who spent, I guess, 4 months being pumped up before he could even be headed toward home. Almost died. But the prisoners had to look after themselves. We had certain heating privileges in the organized prison camps where there was a stove and you could try to heat hot water, and there was an effort to cook things that came in Red Cross packages, but that was sporadic, and there wasn't enough heat, except that when cooking was attempted, the source of wood in a prison camp was the slats in the bunks.
Oh, sure.
They started out a solid series of boards side by side, but as time progressed, the boards got farther and farther apart, so it was more like a sieve. And the old-timers, of course, who'd been there a while, knew how to protect their turf and their boards, and when somebody left or turned their back, they'd be snatching the boards from somebody else that wasn't as smart.
Never heard that story before. Very interesting.
And it's, you might say, a morale item, because if you're sleeping on 3 2-inch planks, you're not doing very well. It led to hard feelings. It led to bloodshed when somebody got caught doing that.
Wow.
Sure. Yeah, things were not well in that. As we got on the road, however, we became totally independent. We were supplied food. We had to do whatever we could, eat it raw. And that's where the Kriege stove came in. That's another thing we have here. I made one. That's not an original. That's a number 10 can. In a Red Cross package, that probably held powdered milk. It was a European product, probably made in England because the other countries were occupied and supplying very little. It was called Klim, K-L-I-M, which is milk spelled backwards. But you could reconstitute it, and it was important nourishment. But on the other hand, it made a stove. Top is cut out. The Red Cross package included a tiny can opener, so you had the ability to do that. It was a little bitty thing about that long that you could work your way through. And you could also, with it or something else, cut notches in the side, bend triangular notches, you bend them in, you drop the cover of the can and make a bottom.
Yeah.
And then you start feeding it. Wood, hay, sticks, bed slats, whatever you can get in those cracks, and you can create a fire in there. Wire across the top where you can sit a can or something, and you've got yourself a stove that works. It's called a Kriege. stove, Kriegie, which we called ourselves because Germans called us Kriegsgefangen. Krieg is war, Gefangen means prisoner or captive or war fallen or something like that. It was much easier to say Krieg. So that's a Kriegie stove, and this is another kind of a can that you could use to put on the stove. So we made our way that way with the Red Cross packages.
Somebody delivered them? How did you get the Red Cross packages?
German Army received it. The American Red Cross delivered it. The German Army provided transportation.
I see.
And we got it after they had taken their skim.
Of course they did.
It was in greater or less, sometimes it was 4 packages to 4 people to a package, sometimes 6. I don't think
That's a consideration, considering that those packages weren't
No,
that big in the
no,
first
but
place.
they
So
were-
you were meager on meager
Well,
ration.
I've said it before, and I will continue as long as I live. Those packages were lifesavers.
Yeah.
They preserve people, and I owe something to them, I'm sure. You wonder about the ability of the American soldier to cut cans after you've been frisked and you're not supposed to have any knife, or to find wire. I mean, everywhere you went on the road, you found something and it disappeared.
Sure.
And so that things were overlooked and loaned around, and survival was possible.
That was the name of the game.
Yep. In the effects of starvation, first of all, everybody and his brother becomes a gourmet cook in their mind. They never have been near a kitchen. Their mother might have showed them something on the stove. There were little libraries in some of the camps with a few cooking books or stories of home cooking. Could not keep those on the shelves. They were drawing them off. They were writing down the recipes. They were talking endlessly about food and cooking and their favorite restaurants and all the rest. And I noticed just in recent times, somebody has done a very careful survey of about how starvation affects the human mind. It leads to hallucinations. They found scientifically nowadays. Well, it did. That's true. We researched it before, and if there ever were hallucinations, it was what these folks were going through. It also, starvation, shuts down all of the usual barracks room conversation. There is little, if any, talk of girls. There is no talk of sex. And that's it. Anyway, that's how starvation works. We moved on after having talked about...
Did you think, let me pause for just a minute, Robert. Because this is something most of us can't conceive of. Obviously, I haven't starved in a long, long, long time. I might use that phrase when I walk in at night saying I'm starving,
Yes.
after I had a very opulent lunch a couple of times, a couple of hours before that. But most of the people watching this program have no idea what
Yes.
that must be like. And
Yes.
it's a gradual process.
Yes, it is. Yes,
So
it
you
is.
didn't say to yourself, I'm going to die if I don't get some food. But I just
That
want to try
thought-
to get into your mind a little bit about.
That thought,
Did you think you might die if not of
I don't
starvation?
think so. That wasn't on our horizon. We had never experienced that. We didn't know how to think about it. And I don't recall that subject coming to my mind or being talked about. I didn't reach that point in the conversation with this fellow I knew who almost died. I don't think we knew about that as Americans. We were well fed. I was personally, after being captured, I was issued 2 loaves of black bread to retain me as long as I was on the road to my next stop. I didn't eat anything for probably 3 days, first on, due to a variety of causes, but hunger was not an issue then. I had food if I wanted it. After that, it was conversational. It was, when is it going to arrive? It's what is in that big 20-gallon pot. Am I going to get my share of, quote, solids, unquote, or am I going to get water this time? Is there a piece of meat in there? You remember my story about
Yes.
the piece of tendon?
Yeah.
Well, your stomach grinds. You get dizzy. You're weak and wobbly. You can see the meat coming off your bones. Hunger pangs are the greatest thing, and that's where my piece of tendon was very
Yeah.
helpful. Chewing gum that came in a Red Cross package was very helpful, because if you keep your jaws going or chew your tongue, the pangs subside. But as far as thinking about possibility of dying, in the Japanese camps, diet deficiencies, beriberi,
Oh, yeah.
scurvy, and pellagra, and all that were frequent. I don't recall such things happening in the camps that we were in. We were not in tough shape for more than 4 months before liberation. Everything broke down by Christmas, but it was gradual. And then, of course, as we moved, we got closer to our Red Cross food supplies. So it didn't quite hit us. And the mental operation was, how do you deal with hunger pangs, but not how do you face death. And of course, there were deaths. People died of hunger, not induced, but injuries or illnesses that they couldn't fight for lack of having.
Well, what's amazing,
left.
you know, you had a spirit that caused you to survive and never give up and all of that, but it's amazing to us, or to me anyway, how little it requires to sustain a human body. I mean,
Survival is in the human nature, I think.
I guess so.
Yeah, whatever it is.
So you didn't have 3 squares a day.
2 meals, not square.
Yeah.
One was water, well, Ursat's coffee.
Yeah, you told me
And
about that
if
too.
if we had saved a chunk of our bread ration, you could have that. You already possessed it. You kept it inside your shirt, or someone would steal
I
it.
just want our viewers to get a feeling of what that must have been like, because we're so far removed from it.
Well, I'll tell you another thought. I described the bread slicing operation before, where 1 cutter and 6 or 8 experts watching.
Sure.
Well, there were always crumbs left from the slicing. Those crumbs were as valuable
Oh, sure.
as the bread.
Sure.
And I learned to trace crumbs and lick my finger, as everybody did. I can still do that with the best. It's just, it's in me.
I love it.
It's in me. Yeah.
Of course it is.
Yeah. And
I love it.
we'll turn this conversation, if we ever get there, the other way when comes time that you are in U.S. Army food service. And that did kill some people.
Really?
Sure, you can't just go from starvation to
Of course not.
full GI
It's
diet.
like drinking a gallon of water when you're dying
Well, yeah.
of thirst. Sure.
Yeah, things like that. But that's a later story. Anyway, let's see where we went. Well, anyway, the first 2 or 3 days out of Nuremberg were in bad weather, and we were rushed. They wanted to get us out of town. I don't know exactly how close the American armies were, but the urge was to get us out of town. At some stage, at about that period of time, and it may have been later than when we left Nuremberg, there were negotiations between the armies, and the Germans had committed themselves not to march prisoners on the highway aimlessly anymore, but to keep them in camps or get them to camps. And somewhere along the line, that deal was cut, and that's why we didn't keep going beyond the final camp. However, there was an urge to get us on the move, so we marched along with so-called Volkssturm soldiers carrying rifles that I thought came from the Franco-Prussian War.
That bad, huh?
Well, yeah, and these were the older
Yeah.
fellows, and maybe even as old as you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they kept up with us. However, we were divided into platoons of perhaps 50 people, and with 1600, we were stretched out over perhaps a half a mile and proceeded along there was extra care taken because several uniformed younger people with dogs supervised the outskirts and make sure stragglers got in line and things like that. They weren't exactly SS, but they were specially trained people. And when we would stop, which occasionally happened for the threat of an air attack, we'd stop and we'd all take to the sides of the road. We just collapsed. On some of those marches at that period of time, we were so weak and so unaccustomed to exercise that I found myself literally slogging along in my sleep. My brain was dead. My legs were working. There's no explanation.
Well, you didn't have enough fuel to
That's
keep
it.
the body going.
That's
yeah.
right. That's it. But just absolutely brain dead. When you landed in the ditch for a break, you were out.
But I suppose that would cloud your memory of that time period
Well,
too.
you were
hardly cognizant, right?
Of course, going back, that is the life of an infantry soldier. Go till you're dead, you fall down, and you're instantly, completely asleep and helpless. Well, I had an occasion where I fell asleep, and the guard dog came up and waked me up, stuck his nose under my ear.
Oh, is that? Yeah.
And nuzzled me, and his leader gave me a boot in the rear and got me back up on the road again. Nothing more than that. They were nice, friendly dogs, I guess, until they were given the word. But I was just a hopeless case, not a threat. So I got that kind of treatment. At one point, we were marching on the road on a clear day, and a pair of P-47 American fighter bombers came down on our right side about 100 yards away from us and took out a small railroad station that was just that far away from us. They bombed it and they strafed it. And we, of course, were taken by surprise, and everybody threw themselves into the ditches. And where we were, farther back in the column, nothing happened to us, but when they finished their attack, they did a left turn and swept right over the lead edge of this column, a half a mile long, and they fired on it. And let's see, we lost 3 killed and 3 wounded out of the marching column. More or less at that same time, we were halted for 4 hours on the road for no particular reason except that we came to realize that there were great numbers of American bombers flying over us. And as we sat there, we observed a 1,000-plane raid taking place on Nuremberg. We perhaps were 20 miles away at that time. And of course, we'd heard of them. We'd never seen one. We couldn't see much except that it was a clear day, and you could see the flashing sun off the airplanes as high as they were and as far away as they were, and they were like bees around a hive. They were so thick. They, of course, were being shot at, but we couldn't detect that. We couldn't see anybody coming down in flames. But the impressive thing was that they were pretty well unloading their bombs all at once in a saturation raid. And the combined explosions caused a circle of shockwave that went out, a huge bubble. You've seen pictures of atom bombs go off where that huge bubble arises. It was the same thing that we were seeing from 20. And,
wow.
And there were people down there under it receiving that.
Sure.
So that was very impressive. Germans did not like American aircraft, and they took extreme precautions not to get involved with them, and I'm sure they didn't have any idea who might be flying protection that might break off from that and do some business on the way back and might catch us. I'm sure they were thinking that, and that's why we stayed where we did for as long as we did. We continued on, and or another note, in probably that same raid, some of our people who may still have been on foot from the Hammelburg camp were somewhere on the eastern outskirts of the city. They were going around it. We were on the western side. And that column of Americans got caught in an air raid. You can say it's that one or one just like it, where 25 died, 36 were wounded, and 6 of the guards. There's one guy that I knew that I think was one of the 25 who was killed there. I knew from another camp. As we continued along the road, after those, the miserable weather continued until the 6th of April, and it was raining, and it was not spring, it was darn near freezing. The greatcoat was great for that, being loosely woven wool. Wool gets warm. The water in the wool gets warmed, and so you're warmer in a wool overcoat than you might be.
It's amazing,
otherwise.
yeah.
And I didn't begrudge it a bit. That was good to have. But we came to a walled village called Birching, Berching, which was an ancient medieval place with battlements and a gate, that locked. And we were crammed in there. Every place there was space to get us out of the weather. I was stuck in the guardhouse at the gate. And there must have been 50 of us all piled in that thing like sardines, but we were out of the wet, and that was a pretty good stop after the bad days we'd been through. Birching was, I don't know where I get this information, but I found out that Birching was a site in 1298 where they had a massacre of Jews.
You got
1298.
I had never heard of that before.
No, there's a monumental work produced by somebody about the whole history of the war, and that cropped out in that somewhere that I
Isn't that
discovered.
amazing?
Nobody would have paid any attention to that factoid, but there it is. So we're doing historic countryside.
This, with your permission, I think we've finished our tape for this time.
Okay.
So you must invite us back, and we'll talk a little bit more in just a moment.
All right.
We've collaborated with the camera off and decided that we do have enough information for another program. So this is going to be a quadrangle of 4 sides, and this is the third one. You tell the story in a fascinating way. You, being the organized person that you are, have added facts to support your memories, and that makes it even more interesting.
Wouldn't be much without that.
Well, but it's very easy for me, because I have such great empathy, it's easy for me sitting next to you to absorb, because I want to, absorb what the feelings that you were feeling. That's why I asked you about starving, and it's easy for us to 60 years later to say, you might have been starving and people did die, but just to try to get into your mind at the time. And we should point out that you weren't marching along, analyzing what might happen to you that day or the next day. You're just trying to get from one end of this trek to the next, right?
You're right.
Just trying to get through the day.
Yes.
And you're the way the mind and body is put together, I mean, you switch into a survival mode.
Correct.
And
Yes.
sometimes you don't have to think about it. Sometimes it's just, okay, I got to put this foot here and this foot here, and I'll get through today, and I'll fall down and fall asleep, and when I wake up, they'll make me move again, or the dog will nudge me again.
Just that simple, yes.
But it's that part of it's not too complicated if you think about it.
No.
But I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's an important exercise to go back and rehash these things, because this isn't somebody writing a novel, although they could.
Yes, they could.
This isn't somebody dreaming up a movie and let's have the Germans do this and the Americans do this. You've added a tremendous human first-person element to this story. And you've changed some of my feelings about how this was. I mean, when I was a young person, I'm younger than you are, but I'm not very young. But I was
You're lucky.
I was a child, a young kid during this
Sure.
whole thing. So the war, that war had a whole different feeling for me at home. As a young, it was a righteous war, and we were given.
Very
Yes,
different.
there was propaganda on our side too.
Oh, yeah.
But you've added a human element, is what I'm trying to say. You told us there were German soldiers and even commanders who had some moral concerns about what was right and wrong and whether it was right to exterminate all these prisoners of war and so on. And you've added something because you had a direct relationship with some of your captors along the way. I mean, you were with these guys day in and day out, day in and day out, so you learned a little bit about their mentality.
Yes, you did.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
you did.
I think that's important for us to get that perspective. And I just want our viewers to know that this is truly an important part of history. If you're seeing this program for the first time, I hope you get a chance to see the other chapters that we've done before this, and we'll have a chance to see the next. Wouldn't it be grand if we could put it all together and have a movie rama someday on public access across the North Country and show it all together as one interview? We hope it survived as a part of the archives.
It should be there.
But I want people to know that this is not just a couple of guys, Kelvin and Gordy, sitting in a room with another guy, Bob Booth. This is an important thing that we're doing here today, and we want to realize that it is. I thank you again for sitting with us, Robert. It's very interesting because Kay and I go to 7:30 Mass on Sunday morning. We have a regular routine. We go to breakfast, and then we do our grocery shopping. And guess who I run into every single Sunday morning? Your stalwart son, Matthew, who's pushing his own cart this
Oh,
way.
yes, yes.
And we're like two little old ladies when we get together because we like each other a lot. And so we chat.
Sure.
And you think as the matriarch of the family is the one who loves to chat over the fence, but guys like to talk too. And Matt and I just we talk about our lives in general and our history and past, and our paths have crossed many times, so we have a lot of fun. So the last time I saw him, I said, "Is your dad back?" He said, "Yep, my dad's back. I think he's ready to go." So, that having been said, we'll be back with another chapter, as they say, Lord willing, and the creek doesn't rise. We'll be sitting in these chairs again to round out this conversation about Robert Booth. And my personal thanks again, as I must do at the end of every one of these programs, for your contribution at that time. All through the years. You're a wonderful human being, a patriot, and a great friend, and I thank you again for allowing us to sit at our table and rehash some of these great old stories.
I think they're useful, and it's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Our best to Helen, although we didn't get her on camera this time. We did talk to her for a moment. Our audience got to hear the phone ring a few times and so on. But that's what Hometown Cable is all about. And thank you all for viewing this program and enjoying what we think is an important thing in history. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.